let's just jump right in. So these are the topics that we're going to cover today, and as you can see, there's quite a bit of information we're going to try and get through, so we'll keep it moving nicely for you. So let's start with what is a cyber risk. So this coverage is designed to address the full breadth of risks associated with doing business. So the policies essentially provide a risk management tool for data security breaches through insurance, since that can lead to a whole slew of different types of losses. So a cyber attack generally refers to a criminal activity conducted via the internet, but these attacks can include stealing an organization's intellectual property, confiscating online bank accounts, creating and distributing viruses on your computers, or posting your personally identifiable information on the internet. So the insurance policies would basically cover the direct loss, the legal liability, and the consequential loss resulting from those cybersecurity breaches. And the policies themselves would include first and third party coverages, which I'll go through later on in the show, so you can get a better understanding of what the insurance policies can offer you. So the privacy breaches includes that personal information, the network security breaches, again, the first and third party expenses, and the exposures arising out of your internet communications. In the wake of a cyber incident, significant expenses can be incurred, defending the litigation, indemnifying the individuals whose information was breached, and responding possibly to the state attorney generals or the Federal Trade Commission or the Securities and Exchange Commission, depending on what the services are that you're providing. The costs of investigating the cyber breaches and complying with the notification laws can also be quite significant. So there's an institute called the Ponemon Institute, and they do a study every year to investigate cyber breaches and what's included in that. And their study in 2013 shows that the loss or misuse of information assets is the most significant consequence of a cyber attack. So based on those findings, organizations really need to be more vigilant in protecting their most sensitive data and confidential information. So just as a background, the Ponemon Institute, it's basically they take 60 different companies or organizations nationwide in different industry sections, so they can get a general understanding of what the breaches are. And they found in 2013 the average annualized cost of a cybercrime was 11.6 million out of those 60 organizations, which is up 26% from the previous year. In 2012, the average cost was 8.9 million. And the average range was 1.3 to 58 million. So obviously, depending on the size of your organization, there can be a difference there, but it's pretty significant. Another fact is that the most costly cybercrimes are those caused by denial of service or malicious insiders and web-based attacks. But the good news for everyone here is that the insurance market is more competitive than ever. The coverage has really been around for the last probably 10 years, but really in the last 5 years, it's really opened up and broadened. So there's lots of different options for a company to review. Every policy is a little bit different, and that's what you need to look for when you're looking at a policy. So let's talk about some current breaches that you guys have probably seen on the news. I picked 3 that occurred in the last year that I thought might be interesting to share. So the first one is it's the Living Social. I don't know if you've heard of this company, but they're a deal-a-day website that features discounted gift cards that can be used at nationwide retailers. And they're based in Washington, D.C. They have 70 million members worldwide. And the breach, their system was breached, and 50 million of their 70 million clients' information had been hacked into. So they basically had to notify all of those 50 million individuals. They don't think that their the accounts had fully been compromised, but because their system had been breached, they had to notify all those individuals, which is quite costly. And I'm sure they probably had to hire a PR firm and things like that to help restore their reputation, because they're not going to want to lose their clients and all the costs associated with that. And typically, they'll offer a credit monitoring for any individuals whose information was breached as an option. So that's quite a large one. And then the next one is Target, which I'm sure everyone's heard about or been personally affected by. I know I had to get a new debit card personally. But so basically what happened here was thieves had acquired the personal or payment information for as many as 110 million of their clients, which is an astronomical number. And they gained access to the retailer's computer system through network credentialing stolen from a heating and refrigeration vendor. And the attack was, but they said that the attack was extremely unimpressive and unremarkable because they used a very basic malware to get into their system. And so I think Target's going to be in a load of trouble because their IT team should have been able to catch this malware. So basically left their credit card information unencrypted as it was being transmission through. So I've been told by an underwriter that sits on one of the excess layers that they have at least 100 million in coverage, and they're sure that all the layers are going to be hit on the insurance because it's just going to be an astronomical claim. So, so even these large companies who you think is going to have these really amazing IT departments can really have holes in what they're doing, which is scary. And the last breach was the New York City Transit Authority. So this one kind of seemed old school. This is why I picked it. But they found social security numbers and other personal information of 15,000 of the New York City Transit workers. It was found on a CD inside of a refurbished computer that was sold by a random retailer. So I don't know how often you would see that anymore, but this information could have been sitting around from many, many, many years ago, and it's coming back to haunt them now, and it's found in this very peculiar place. But they had to notify those 15,000 workers, and they offered, their credit monitoring services to them, and the cost was quite high, but I'm sure that had happened from many, many years before. So even now, if you have a nice IT team in place, past issues can come back to haunt you, unfortunately. So now let's just chat about who is actually at risk. What types of businesses are at risk? Basically everyone. Most companies now will have a website, and that will be easy access for criminals to access some information from you. Or if they have PII is personally identifiable information. So if they have any PII stored in their computer networks or in paper files, they're both covered by the privacy policies. Let me see here. According to the security software developer, Semantics, they have an internet security threat report, and their report of 2013 said that companies with fewer than 250 employees were the focus of 31% of all cyber attacks in 2012, which was an 18% jump from 2011. So, in doing some of the reading, it seems like some of the cyber criminals are actually starting with some of the smaller companies because they know they don't have the IT infrastructure in place or the risk management in place to prevent that. So it's kind of like a little playground for them to learn how to get into systems and how to find information and what works to try and get this information. And obviously that can be a very costly problem for a smaller company to have. The next is any companies that used outsourced technology or cloud providers, which a lot of companies are doing these days. But the biggest concern with cloud computing is the security risks. That includes both the physical security of the cloud environment, so where that structure is that's being housed. Do they have what are they going to do if a tornado or a hurricane or a fire happens? What's going to happen to your information? But it also refers to the information your business maintains. So the cloud environment is a shared space. So you might be sharing servers with some of your competitors or other individuals, which could leave it open to information getting shared. Most cloud vendors approach cloud security through the typical methods, such as encryption, firewalls, and that type of thing. But you want your cloud provider to look past that, past the basic securities, and have a clear administrative access controls and measures to isolate those types of attacks. And also, if your company has to meet PCI compliance, which is the payment card industry, so if you're taking credit cards for payments, you'll also want to make sure that your cloud vendor complies with those same laws, because they'll be held accountable as well. And you'll also want to look into availability. So the customers hosting their sites over a public cloud, you're going to want to expect the highest availability of your information. So it's good to look at your service agreements with them and see how they address reports if there's outages and that type of thing. So essentially, you're just going to want to look for a very well-established cloud computing company to work with. And lastly, is if you have employees. I mean, it's very basic. A survey done in April 2013 by network security firm AlgoSec, they found that insider threats are still one of the top worries of IT and security professionals, and about 28% of the firms agreed with that statement. Several things can happen. You can have a disgruntled employee that could either collaborate with a third party to commit cyber crimes, or they could themselves steal the information and post it on the internet if they have a grievance with their employer. Or they could just accidentally, and this is more common, they could accidentally share the personal identifiable information. So you could take a situation where you have an HR director who's trying to email some spreadsheets with people's salaries and their social security numbers and that type of thing to another HR person and accidentally hit all and send it out. Or they could send it to a client list, or any type of situation like that. And then they would be stuck with having to notify them, and that's a breach. Or more commonly, if a laptop or a USB drive is stolen, even if it's encrypted or has password protected and that type of thing, which obviously is essential, they're still at risk of having a breach and having to notify and keep within the laws. Let's talk about what is covered. So this is the actual insurance policy forms that I'm going to talk about now, and the types of coverages that you can look to have included. So there's first and third party coverages, and I'll start with the first party exposures and then move on to the third. So the first is notification costs. These are the costs associated with notifying the individuals whose information has been breached. And 46 of the 50 states have laws, specific laws requiring that notification is done. So it's not really if you feel like being a good person and doing it or not. There's laws requiring it, or you can get fined and penalized as a result if you don't. The next is credit monitoring. So that's the cost associated with providing your clients whose information was breached those services. Now that is not legally required, but it's basically a good faith measure, given to your clients to help try and restore their faith and try and retain them as a client. So that is typically offered, and it is included in your insurance policies. The next is data restoration and forensic costs. So that's the cost associated with hiring a forensic expert or analyst to come in and look at your system and try and determine what information was lost, and if they can either restore it or if they need to duplicate it and get you back up and running to how you were operating before the breach occurred. That can be quite costly, actually. The next is crisis management. So those are the costs associated with hiring a PR firm to kind of help get your name back in good graces with your clients and keep everybody at ease about what's going on and that type of situation. The next is the privacy regulatory defense and penalties. So that's the fines and penalties that come into play with if a breach happens and you break any of the many laws that are in place right now. As a result of those breaches, it would pay for those fines and penalties that are brought by governmental issues or governmental agencies or anyone of that nature. The next is business interruption and extra expense. That's the cost associated with basically getting you back online and any costs associated with that. So if for some reason a breach occurred and it shut down your system and you lost revenue because you weren't able to do your normal business for a few days or whatever, that would pay for the lost revenue during that time period until you get back online and operational again. And then the last one is cyber ransom and extortion. So that's the cost associated with hiring an independent negotiator or consultant. And that actually happens quite frequently. A hacker will come in and steal your personally identifiable information and then threaten you and say, we're going to leak this on the internet, which would then cause them to have to notify and do all that, as well as just bad publicity and whatnot. So they'll say, if you don't give us $200,000, we'll do this. So that happens quite frequently, and it is covered in an insurance policy. So let's talk about the third-party coverages now. So the first one is multimedia liability. So it's not intended to replace a technology or a marketing consultancy policy, but this is the amount that you would become legally obligated to pay as damages and related expenses directly resulting from the dissemination of media materials to others. So that could include copyright trademark infringement, any of the defamation, libel, slander, product disparagement, that type of thing, or your intellectual property. So if you have intellectual property on your network and it was breached, that could cause difficulties for you because if that was released publicly, because that's your proprietary information. The next is security liability. This is kind of long-winded, but I wanted to read it all to you guys, so I apologize for just staring at my sheet, but there's a lot of information here. It's basically, there's four main areas for this. So it's the failure to prevent or hinder a breach, which in turn results in one of the following: copying, altering, destruction, deleting, or damage to electronic data stored in your computer system, theft, loss, or unauthorized disclosure of electronic or non-electronic confidential information, corporate information, personally identifiable information, or private information that's in your care, custody, or control, or in your outsourced IT service provider's care, custody, and control on your behalf. Unauthorized access to or unauthorized access or use of a computer system other than your own, or failure to prevent the transmission of a malicious code or virus to a third party. A privacy breach, which means unauthorized access or use of the named insured's computer system, denial of service attacks against your clients, or infection of your computer systems by a malicious code or virus. And lastly, failure to prevent or hinder participation in your computer system in a denial of service attack directed against internet sites or other computer systems of third parties. That's a lot of information. So, but basically, it's your failure to prevent or hinder a breach from occurring. And last, loss of employee information. So your employee information is considered just like a third party's information. So their personally identifiable information, you'd have to notify them the same as you would a third party, and the insurance policies include employees as well as third parties. So that would be covered as well. Now let's talk about the gap, because initially when people were talking about privacy liability or cyber attacks, they would say, well, wouldn't there be some coverage here in my general liability, or couldn't the business interruption be picked up in my property policy, because there's business interruption in there, but it's very specifically not included in a lot of these policies. A cyber attack is considered intangible property. So I know in your property policy, it's the physical loss or damage to tangible property would be covered, and a cyber breach is considered intangible, so it would not be picked up there. So the only place for coverage would be in your privacy policy. I thought it would be good just to go through a few of the state and industry-specific regulations. I won't bore you too long with it, but I wanted to talk specifically about Oregon, since I'm sure that's the most interesting to you. But first, I wanted to talk about how the different states themselves, what's considered personal information varies state by state. So the great thing about an insurance policy is that these carriers hire these independent vendors that basically you call 24/7 in the event of a breach, and they walk you through this whole process. So you as a company don't need to know what all the regulations and what the definitions of personal information is and when you need to notify and not. The insurance carriers vendors are there to walk you through that, because it can be very tricky and it varies very much state by state. So if you have clients in other states, their laws may be different than even here in Oregon. So for example, I just picked Wyoming versus California, because I was going through, they're starting to get a little bit more similar, but so Wyoming's definition of personally identifiable information is a first name or initial along with your last name combined with any one of the following. So a social security number, a driver's license number or a state ID card, an account number or credit card number along with a PIN and the security code, or in Wyoming, a tribal ID card, or a federal or state government issued ID card. So if the name along with any one of those is stolen by a third party, then that would constitute you needing to notify them. And in California, it's similar up until they have the name and the social security and or driver's license and the account number, but they don't have the tribal ID or the federal and state, and instead they have medical information. There's a whole slew of what's described under, your medical information, but it's pretty in-depth. So every state is a little bit different, so it's good to have these carriers that can help navigate that for you. So in Oregon, personally identifiable is considered the first name or initial with the last name in combination with any of the following: the social security number, your driver's license or ID, or an account or credit card number in combination with a security code or access code or password. So if any of those are breached, you guys would be liable to notify the individuals. And there's time restraints on when you have to notify, and every state's different as to when the time frames are. So in Oregon, it basically just says as soon as possible. So that leaves it a little bit open to interpretation, which is nice because there's not a specific, in 4 days from learning of the breach you have to notify. So the ways that they say you have to notify would be one of the following: either a written notification, electronic, if that's the way that you would normally communicate with your clients, via emails, or telephone notice, provided that you can directly reach the individual that's breached. And the only reason that notification can be delayed is if a law enforcement agency determines that it's, part of it's impeding a criminal investigation or something along those lines. And if the investigation into the breach determines that there's no reasonable likelihood that it would harm their customers, then you wouldn't have to notify them. But otherwise, you would have to notify them. Lastly, this is kind of an interesting caveat, and most states have this, is there's a substitute notice. So if you can demonstrate that the cost of notifying your customers would exceed $250,000, or the number of individuals is more than 350,000, then you can either put it on your website. Instead of having to individually notice, you could put a notice on your website or a link on your website that talks about it, or you can notify a statewide television and news media, newspaper type media, and kind of just blast it out there that way, which kind of stinks because then everyone knows you had this giant breach, but it would be more cost effective. So, but if you have an insurance policy, then that might be the route to go anyway. So. And then the time frames is, again, most expedient time possible without reasonable delay unless it's being investigated by a governmental agency. Okay, I'm going to really zoom through this stuff because we can get into this all day. But there's really just a handful of, there's many laws into effect with regard to, privacy breaches and how you handle them and the preventative measures you should or shouldn't have had in place and whatnot. So the three main cybersecurity regulations are the HIPAA, which I'm sure you've all heard of. I'm sure you've signed it when you go to your doctor every time. The 1999 Graham-Leach-Bliley Act and the 2002 Homeland Security Act. And basically those three acts regulate, they mandate that healthcare organizations, financial institutions, and federal agencies protect their systems and information, and it gives very specific descriptions of how they need to do that. So they're constantly changing and evolving, and I know that the U.S. Congress had proposed numerous bills to expand upon those acts and add additional acts depending on the different industry sectors across the United States. So we can provide more information on specific acts if you have questions later. So now I wanted to go through just some general claims. So examples, the ones that I talked about earlier, I mean, we all don't work for a Target that has, we're not these huge organizations. So these might be a little bit more relatable just to the rest of us. So the first example was, it was a university, a password-protected laptop was stolen. It was a university admittance employee. It was a password-protected laptop, but there was all of their students and a lot of the students' parents' personal information and financial information on there. So they ended up having to notify all of those individuals and offer the credit monitoring. There might have even been some fines and penalties that they had to pay as far as that goes as well. But I don't know how often you hear of laptops being stolen. I know personally, I left my cell phone in my dash of my car and ran into Costco, and I don't usually leave it out, but I did, and my window was bashed open and they stole my laptop, or my phone, and luckily it was not the one I used for work, so it didn't have any of my work information. But apparently at the same time, 3 other cars had been broken into in a half an hour's time, and I think 2 other laptops have been stolen out of cars. I mean, it just happens all the time. You run in after work to go into Costco, boom, there it goes. And it could be pretty serious, depending on how much information you have on there. The next one, this is interesting. So, because you want your employees at work to download music, right? Well, someone downloaded, it's called Limewire software, so they can download music. It's a peer-to-peer sharing software, and it basically somehow, a malware got in there, and 2,000 private files were released to the public. Somebody got in there and stole the information, so they ended up having to notify those individuals. But something as innocent as that, someone's like, I'm going to play some music while I'm working, and it just happens. So the next one is a stock brokerage firm. This is the rogue employee, the disgruntled employee. They basically went in and implanted a malicious code on purpose, and it took down 2/3 of the company's network, and it hindered their investments and racked up quite a big bill. So I'm assuming if they had business interruption coverage, it would cover those lost revenues during that time, as well as the cost to rebuild their system and restore it. pretty serious. So this is an interesting chart. So Darwin is an insurance carrier, and they don't have this up currently, but I had this. It might be the numbers might be a little off. It's from a couple years ago, but this just shows the average costs that you can expect to incur if a breach happens. And this is if you have 1,000 people's personally identifiable information breached, what an average cost is. And this does not include business interruption costs, which I think can be up to 38% additional costs depending on how it affects the insured. So as you can see, it goes through the different insuring clauses that I discussed earlier. Pretty significant costs. So I'm comparing the 1,000 with 100,000. So as you can tell, it goes up quite a bit. And like I said, the average was in the Ponymon study was 11.8 million. So not including the business interruption, it's pretty much right on track with what they're thinking. So it can go anywhere from 100 and something to 8-9+ million. So really, if you have an insurance policy in place, it's a good way to mitigate your costs. If you spend anywhere from $2,000 to $15,000, depending on, it can go depending on what your services are, and Dawn will get into that later. But it can really help mitigate your exposures there. Because I don't know about you, but $8 million could put a lot of companies out of business. So they're not going to have that sitting around to pay for it. The evolution of insurance. So as I mentioned earlier, I remember like maybe 8 or 9 years ago, AIG was the only company that I knew of at the time that really even wrote anything similar to this. And I remember them coming in and giving us the full spiel about what the coverage was. And the costs were astronomical. The retentions were really high. The coverage was really dumbed down. And we thought, who would buy this? I mean, this isn't a good deal. What is this even covering? But even just since then, really in the last 5 years, the coverages have really gotten more robust. And literally, as a new form comes out, they're working on the new one. So we have some carriers that have had 2 or 3 new additions in a year because they're adding on to the coverages. So there's really a lot of good products out there to look at. And it also means that you really have to go through the forms to see what would best suit you and what your company needs, because they are very different. Physical documents are now covered, where before it was strictly a cyber risk. Now it can be tangible, the files on your desk. Rogue employees are now covered, because that is a pretty large percentage of claims happen because of that, and it wasn't covered before. And include your third-party vendors. So your cloud providers and stuff like that. So the coverage really is evolving as your companies are evolving. We are now on to underwriting requirements. So I will bring Dawn up here.